Konbanwa. Welcome to our first Letting Library Lecture Series of 2022, entitled 80 Years from Incarceration, the Japanese American Story. Tonight, we will explore the before, during, and aftermath of incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Amy Mishima Peterson, a Sansei, third-generation Japanese American, is a docent and speaker for the Japanese American Museum of Oregon. She will examine the overall history of Japanese Americans in our region during the years of internment. Jacob Sherman, an avid historian and local researcher on Nikkei, will explore the Milwaukie Japanese American families and their influence on our city. Councilor Desi Nicodemus will give a special address as well. Thank you in advance for tuning in, and depending on COVID restrictions, we hope we'll have a live audience in the future. A special thank you to Scott Stauffer and all of the City of Milwaukie staff for allowing us to conduct our lecture series inside the beautiful City Hall chambers. Slide. My name is Greg Heemer, the Communications Director of Milwaukie Historical Society, the owners and operators of the world's largest museum dedicated to the history of Milwaukie, Oregon, open Saturdays 1 to 5, located at 3737 Southeast Adams Street. Yes, we have a museum, that one building you've been driving by for 15 years and have never stopped in. Trust me, it is well worth your time to visit to learn more about our historical past from all perspectives. Milwaukie Museum prides itself in telling all stories, as the past is the past, no matter if it is good, bad, or ugly. We work with organizations like Oregon Black Pioneers, Clackamas County Heritage Council, and the Grand Run to expand our knowledge and tell the histories of all people that have lived in the area we call Milwaukie today. Our membership dollars pay for the operations of the museum, making admission free, removing barriers of income inequality for all those who want to learn about our great city. Slide. Although 2021 was challenging, we were allowed to open our doors again in June and held 3 free performances at the museum featuring kid-friendly performers, bringing in over 300 visitors. We also published Art and Wild Adventures on our website, updated our technology, and held 4 Letting Library Lecture Series. Slide. 2022 will be even better. With COVID maybe in our rearview mirror, we will continue our performances at the museum with 4 shows, continue our Letting Library Lecture Series, and hold a historic home tour in the Milwaukie and Lake Road NDA areas. We are also creating a new book and exhibit entitled Then and Now, featuring stories and pictures of the past and comparing them to today. We are excited to be back open and to the public and contributing to local events like First Friday and Farmers Market once we're allowed to join the party. Slide. Speaking of Letting Library Lecture Series, Milwaukie Museum, along with our partners, City of Milwaukie, Letting Library, and Willamette Falls Studios, are proud to present the second Library Lecture Series this year entitled Women's History Project, A Personal Perspective, Wednesday, March 2nd, beginning at 6 p.m. Join us for a celebration of Milwaukee's women as Amelia Gonzalez Clement, a trained anthropologist, will discuss Milwaukie Historical Society's Women's History Project, the process, the interviews, and the findings of her amazing research. Along with Amelia's presentation, we will hear for personal perspective of some of the women interviewed. History will record their accomplishments, but the personal stories will show us the true loving and caring nature of our women of Milwaukie. We also have a special address by Milwaukie City Councilor Catherine Heisey. To learn more, check the Milwaukie History Museum Facebook page or visit the Letting Library for more details. Slide. Milwaukie Museum is funded through donations and membership. Consider becoming a member today. For an individual, it is only $20, and for a business, it is $100. By becoming a member, you will receive information about upcoming events, member-only gatherings, and the opportunities the museum can offer you. A business membership provides advertising on all our literature and provides opportunities for museum involvement in your events. Either way you become a member, your dollars will help ensure that you are preserving Milwaukee's past for future generations, and you are contributing to a wonderful programming like tonight's presentation. Check our website at www.milwaukeemuseum.com to join or stop into the museum. Slide. Now, even though Desi and I do not root for the same team during the real big rivalry weekend in the late fall, we do share a love of Milwaukie. Because of Councilor Nicodemus's dedication to telling the stories of all people in Milwaukie, his contributions to the museum's programming have been second to none. He contributed to the Black Excellence Program in February of 2020, which can still be viewed on Milwaukie Heritage Channel YouTube page. His leadership brought forth this program, which has snowballed. City Council will have a proclamation on this topic February 15th. Ledding Library has a traveling trunk, courtesy of JAMO, about Japanese Americans currently on display. And the museum, along with other partners, are seeking more recognition of our great Japanese American heritage. Councilor Nicodemus has led Milwaukie Museum on a path of reconnecting with our Japanese residents, recording their stories, and beginning conversations. Because of his efforts, along with Jacob Sherman and the City of Milwaukie, Milwaukie Museum was awarded a $1,200 grant to continue the recognition of the Japanese American families from Milwaukie, courtesy of the Clackamas County Arts Coalition. Thank you, Councilor, for the hard work, and the floor is yours.
Oops. Thank you, Greg. Happy Black Excellence Month and happy Lunar New Year. I am very proud to work with the Milwaukie Museum, the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, and the community volunteers hosting the Sledding Library Lecture Series event, exploring the experience of Japanese Americans in Milwaukie. Many residents today may not know it, but we had a small but thriving Japanese American community in Milwaukie before World War II. Many of these families were farmers in the area along Railroad Avenue by Mithron Springs wetlands and the present-day industrial area. These families had to leave their homes and their land when the U.S. government incarcerated them because of their ethnicity in World War II, which President Ronald Reagan later apologized for in 1988. At the event, we will hear from a speaker from the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, as well as community researcher Jacob Sherman, who has looked into some of the area's families. It is an important step in building more and a more just and equitable society to recognize stories about all parts of our history that may have been overlooked or forgotten. Even here in Milwaukie, I'd like to thank everyone who volunteered to help make this event possible. I'd also like to invite you to join me and the City Council on February 15th at 6 p.m. via Zoom for a proclamation to honor the history and contributions of Milwaukee's Japanese American community, especially in light of how 2022 marks the 80th anniversary of the forced incarceration of these members of our community. To find more information about that City Council meeting, please visit milwaukieoregon.gov. Thank you.
Slide. This program would not have been possible without the great work of the Ledding Library. After being closed because of COVID, it is back open. Check it out Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. to 8 p.m., Friday and Saturdays, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., and on Sundays, noon to 6 p.m. Even if you don't want to check out a book, come inside and see the award-winning design. Ledding Library was on the cover of the November Library Journal, received a merit award from the American Institute of Architects, and an honorable mention from the International Interior Design Association. Looking for a gift or something for yourself? Go to the Friends bookstore inside the library and find something for the reader in your life. Check out their website and visit their Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Pinterest accounts for library updates, programs, and information. Slide. The Japanese American Museum of Oregon has been so gracious to our programming tonight. I mentioned before, at the Ledding Library is a traveling display they provided. But more than that, they have taken the time to talk to us, help us introduce this topic, and gave us a private tour of their museum. Located on Northwest Flanders, their museum is a fountain of information and really involves the patron of the Japanese American experience. With hands-on displays, stunning visual effects, and even a jail cell from the Multnomah courthouse where the civil rights activist Minoru Yasui, who would later be awarded a Presidential Medal of Freedom, was incarcerated for 9 months during World War II. Please check their website at www.oregonnikkei.org for hours and how to donate. Our first speaker is Amy Mishima Peterson, a Sansei, third-generation Japanese American, and she is a docent and speaker for JAMO. Please welcome Amy Mishima Peterson.
First, slide. First, I'd like to thank the Ledding Library for presenting this topic. It's something near and dear to my heart. And as they said, as Scott said, I'm a Sansei. I was born after the war. So that's why I'm very American. My name, the way I grew up, everything is pretty much American. Slide. And the Japanese American Museum of Oregon got me involved with finding out my heritage. I have scrapbooks from my parents and my cousin's parents, but I didn't really put it all together until I started working with the Japanese American Museum of Oregon. Slide. So those of you who know or may know about the railroad and the 49ers, the railroad went from the East Coast to the West Coast to San Francisco and ended in 1949. At that time, a lot of the Chinese that were brought over here, because they had people from the East Coast do half of it, and the other half were done by the Chinese from the West Coast because it was cheap labor. So after the railroad was done down there, and some of the Chinese started mining and that sort of thing, then people got upset and they wanted to restrict the Chinese. They didn't want them bringing wives over or women to marry. They didn't want them to start businesses and things like that. So in 1882, the U.S. government enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And that was the first significant law restricting immigration into the United States. However, the railroads to the north, the lines, east-west lines to the north, were not complete. They were somewhere around Montana, and they needed to be finished. So it created a problem for the railroads to be able to not only complete the railroad, but keep it running after that. Slide. So as you can see, this is what they brought the Japanese in for. Now, the Japanese came by boat, either through Canada, Mexico, or San Francisco, Seattle, as an ending point. Then from there, they were shipped to different parts of the United States to help fall the timber, cut the timber into railroad ties, lay the rails, and clear off in the wintertime the snow from the rails so the railroad could actually move. Slide. It was a tough job and a lot of people had difficulty with it. Some opted to save all their money and go to Idaho from Montana. This is Mill City towards Eugene. And my grandfather is in the census and the World War I draft registration in Timber, Oregon. So that's where my paternal grandfather made his mark as far as historically documented here. Slide. However, on my mother's side, there were labor brokers. This was the most famous, most profitable labor broker. His name was Shinsaburo Ban. And not only, slide, did he labor broker, but he had a business. He was a merchant to begin with. And he came from Hawaii and set up shop here where he could sell things, he could do his labor brokering, and he could also help the people who came here. So he just didn't get them a job and send them off on their way. He had goods for them to purchase. He had translation services, legal services, mailing services, and all of these things along the way. Slide. Another company in Oregon was the Teikoku Company, which was established in 1902. It was located on 3rd and Davis in the Merchant Hotel building where our first museum was. The Teikoku Company, or Imperial Company, kept going until 106 years, sorry, you can do the math, 2008, when the last family member decided to retire. Slide. So as these men came over, some as young as 14, 15 years old, and they had no family here, they weren't always typically the second born son. You hear normally where the second son doesn't have any options for inheriting farm property, anything like that. But in this case, in the early 1900s, a lot of first sons came over. And when they got to be here for a while, they got lonely. So they did what any Gen Xer would do, is get on the thing and start dating. Only in their dating was by mail and picture. So they would send a picture of themselves to a prospective family and offer them to marry their daughter. Well, not always does long distance dating work, because not always do the people look the same, because it might have been a picture of him when he came over in 1899, and this is now 1912, and he may have changed a little bit, maybe a little heavier, maybe a little thinner, maybe a little thinner on top. So the picture brides came over, and almost all of them, if you look at the immigration records, they came over with $60 in their pocket. Why $60? Well, because that was the passage back to Japan. So they took the 2-week trip, had $60 in their pocket. If they didn't like the way the guy looked on the dock, then they were able to buy their passage back to Japan. Slide. This is a picture of my grandmother and my grandfather, my maternal grandfather and grandmother, and their marriage certificate. So when my grandmother came over, my grandpa drove up to Seattle to meet her there, and right there on the dock, they were married. And they got all of their paperwork. The Buddhist minister in Seattle married them right there at the immigration office. She got in the car and she came down to Troutdale, Fairview. Slide. It was not easy for a lot of these women. Some of these women were from very well-to-do families or semi-well-to-do families where they were taken care of. My aunt's family had servants that they had. So when they came over, it wasn't easy. They had to learn how to farm. They took care of the kids. They did all the washing. They did all of this stuff and tried to survive a marriage. In some cases, it didn't work because maybe the men, there were a lot of cases of abuse. There were a lot of cases of neglect because the person didn't make as much money. He spent it on gambling and and alcohol. So a lot of times these early marriages didn't always work, but some of them did. And a lot of them lasted 60, 70 years, which is a long time for people when, there wasn't a lot here for them. Slide. Their children, they wanted them to be Americans. They were born here. They became American citizens upon birth. And so they wanted them to be American. They played basketball, slide, and they played volleyball, and they did all sorts of things, slide. And people laugh when I present this slide, but this is a class of sumo wrestlers. And a lot of my parents' friends were of this age where they were sumo wrestling. And the reason they did this was not because they wanted to be sumo wrestlers, because obviously they don't look like sumo wrestlers, but they got to go to the bathhouse after the tournament. So they always looked forward to that. And some of them actually got to eat downtown Portland Japanese food. Slide. But along came December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. Slide. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and destroyed many ships. On that same day, a lot of people were dismayed. Japanese Americans, like you saw in the pictures of the sports teams, were in school. They were loyal Americans. They had no idea what this was going to mean to them. Slide. Immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued presidential proclamations 2525, 2526, and 2527 to authorize the United States to detain allegedly potentially dangerous enemy aliens. The FBI and other enforcement agencies got right on it. A lot of these people had been investigated for over a year because of the ties with the Access. And it was really easy for the FBI to go in and arrest people within hours of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Slide. The Japanese American community, this is Sadaji Shiogi, he was allowed to pack a few things before he got arrested. A lot of people after the initial Pearl Harbor Day arrests kept a suitcase by their bed, knowing that because of their position within the community, they could be the next to go. Mr. Shiogi was a leader in the community. He was also a businessman. A lot of ministers, especially Buddhist ministers, were arrested immediately. Teachers, newspapermen, doctors, dentists, barbers, because barbers hear everything, right? So, slide. They were taken and they were lodged in Multnomah County and then transferred after hearings to Fort Missoula, Montana. Now, Fort Missoula, Montana was used not only by the government for Japanese nationals in the United States, but also prisoners of war were brought to Fort Missoula from Europe to be housed. After that, came the Japanese exclusion. Now, the exclusion was for anybody 1/16 Japanese. So remember, 1/16, you had Japanese nationals and you had the first generation. So we have 50 percenters and 100 percenters, but they wrote this to include anybody a 16th Japanese. Slide. Here is the Teikoku company on the outside this time, but you can see there's an evacuation sale because at the time that they did this exclusion, they locked up all the bank accounts. So the merchants had no way to pay their employees, their vendors. They couldn't get money out of the bank. They couldn't even get money into the bank. If you figured that one, that was a little odd to me, but they couldn't even get money into the bank. Slide. Excuse me. The women, in a lot of times, didn't know where their husbands were. They heard, they didn't always have time to pack up their medicines and all of that sort of thing. So when they had the evacuation sales, some women were not happy to sell a penny on the dollar or even 10 cents on the dollar. So they actually destroyed some of their fine china, family heirlooms, rather than sell it to somebody else. This picture right here is my Uncle George's tag for when he was evacuated, and it shows you that he had to report to the Gresham Fairgrounds on May the 4th between whatever time, at 9 a.m. And a lot of these tags were not only put on belongings, but also put on their children. Slide. Because what thing was more valuable than their children? They were not sure where they were going. They were not sure how they were going. Some of them were expected to drive themselves to incarceration. Some were given bus opportunities to take a bus to incarceration. Slide. But as you can see, some parents were extremely distraught, and they didn't want to even lose them amongst the hundreds of people at the assembly centers. Slide. This is a picture of Reverend Terakawa's daughters in their cubicle, but they weren't all this nice to begin with. At first, there were wood floors. So if you know anything about livestock, and being from Milwaukie, you might, that livestock just walk around and do their business whenever and wherever they are. And in an enclosed area, like a livestock exhibition, where there's just stalls for them to stay in all day until they're brought up for auction, there's a little bit of a smell. So my uncle Richard was in charge of finding pallets to put down over the manure, and then eventually they got plywood to go over the pallets or the manure. My uncle Henry, who was 8 at the time, was charged with going out and getting straw to stuff into gunny sacks and make mattresses and pillows. So you could take all of that yourself, but you would have to carry all of this on your own. Slide. So here's a map of the concentration camps in the American West. And originally it was said that if you were inland 150 miles from the coastline, then you would be incarcerated or removed from that area. In some cases, they gave people the option to move out of the area, which some college students were able to do. But if you look at the map, it jogs, and it jogs in really funny areas. So it jogs in Washington way over 250 miles. In Oregon, there's some slim 150, but then it kind of goes out. And those areas where it went out is where a lot of the farmland was. So that far reaches of Oregon on the north side is Hood River. And Hood River is known for the very first anti-Japanese organizations in the United States. They wanted the Japanese gone. So the Japanese some of them did take their farming elsewhere, and that's where on the southern end of the Washington side, you see it go way past the 250 miles to Yakima, Wapato, Washington. So it went as far as what the government official at the time or in charge designated. So originally it was 150 miles, but then they had that authority to make it whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, wherever they wanted. And so that's why the map jogs a little bit. The little white dots are the concentration camps. And you can see that some of them are actually in excluded areas. So why are you putting them in excluded areas when you want them excluded from those areas? These are some questions that keep coming up because we don't understand. It's difficult to understand. Slide. Another misunderstanding or questionable standing is that the military were there for the Japanese protection. Do you feel very protected if you were the Japanese standing next to the train? I've spoken to school groups and they go, well, no. Look at the soldiers have their backs to everybody else and they're pointing with their guns towards the Japanese people. That makes me very uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable. Imagine the people standing next to the train. It's pretty uncomfortable. And then just recently, I heard a speaker on OPB talking about the Japanese experience because he just released a book on it. And he said, if this was for their protection, what does that say about our communities? If they had to protect the Japanese from the citizens, their neighbors, what does that say? It's an interesting thought. I'd never thought about it that way before. Slide. So remember, they said that they wanted anybody 1/16 or more incarcerated. These are pictures of children by Ansel Adams, who was a government photographer, that these are orphans that were taken out of orphanages within that 150-mile radius or distance and taken and put into the internment camps. So these children are in Manzanar internment camp, and because they're very dangerous enemy aliens, as you can see. Slide. So since we didn't have enough Japanese Americans at the time, the U.S. government went to South America, Latin America, to speak to the other governments. And actually, there was a strategic reason for that. However, no one shared it with these people. The U.S. government wanted to be sure that there wasn't any connection between any of the Access governments and South America that could create a partnership or support and attack the U.S., much like what we're seeing currently. And this is what's scary. This is where the old adage, if you don't look at the past, you run the risk of repeating history. So we really need to be thinking about what we're doing, how we're doing it, and make sure that these things don't happen again. But the U.S. government transported about 2,200 Japanese people from Latin America to Texas. They didn't speak English. A lot of them didn't speak Japanese. They spoke mostly Portuguese. Now, after the war, they traded 900 of them for Japanese that were incarcerated in Japan after the war. 1,000 were repatriated to Japan, where they've never lived, didn't have family or any money. And some petitioned to stay, but they were just released with no documentation, with no money, nothing. And this travesty is hardly ever spoken of. There was a gentleman who tried to get redress for these people, but he died before anything was passed. Slide. This beautiful picture of Minnedoka is where a lot of the people from Oregon and Washington were sent. So luxurious and green and glowing, and just like Milwaukie, right? I don't think so. Slide. This is a painting of Tule Lake, California, where my mom was originally sent. Her uncle was one of the men incarcerated in Fort Missoula, and so all of this family was sent to Tule Lake. But later on, when they had the loyalty questionnaire and they had all of these people from other camps and other areas that said no, they weren't going to fight for the U.S., they weren't going to say they were loyal to the U.S., they were sent to Tule Lake. So in order to make room for them, anybody that was not a threat, they were sent to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. Slide. This is a picture of the Nissa tent camp in Nissa, Oregon, where my father's family was sent. My uncle, the one that had to go get pallets for the floors, lasted about 2 weeks in the assembly center. The Nagaki brothers that they grew up with came back from a excursion to check this out and said, yes, this is much better than being someplace unknown. It's hard work, but we can do it. So they made about 15 cents a day originally, and then it got to be more after that. But the original crew of 15 that went and actually stayed there the first set, got on the train with the window shades pulled down and all of that. But this was the original tent camp. They had a potbelly stove and cots. So, slide. So you remember this photo of these people all being protected here. They got onto the train. They were told to pull the shades down, and they were ordered, do not look out the window. Pretty scary for some young kids who really, really wanted to see what was outside. Slide. In this picture, you see a picture of our Senator Mark Hatfield, Governor Senator Mark Hatfield, who was going to U of O at the time and had a lot of friends of Japanese descent. He actually saw them off, but one thing he regretted was not speaking up on behalf of the Japanese and speaking against incarceration. It bothered him all of his life. And so he spent his rest of his lifetime working towards equality and making sure that prejudice didn't exist in his world. And even though it may have only been a part of his world, it was still, he still made an impact on a lot of us. Slide. So one of the first things that happened at the alien camps is that the government fed them, right? You incarcerate them, you've got to feed them. What do you feed them? Well, you feed them what any good old American eats: bread, potatoes, meat. It's not exactly a Japanese diet. It was like my aunt said when she came over on the boat to the United States when she was 19 years old. She was sick for the first week. And then one day she was wandering the ship and she could smell Japanese food, familiar smells. So she snuck her head in and said, I've really been feeling badly. Can I have at least have some soup? And so she was able to get some miso soup and she felt better. And pretty soon she was able to get more Japanese food and less of the heavy white products. And finally made the 2 weeks to get to the United States. The people in the camps felt the same way. Some of them were very sick and a few of them died because they didn't have the nutritional things that they had outside. So instead of red meat, they contacted their fish vendors and got fish delivered to some of the camps. They had seed packets they ordered from Sears and Roebuck or wherever and got seed packets in and started growing things. Because they said, can we do this? We really do want to have food. Not only did they grow enough produce for their camp, but they transferred what excess they had to the other camps. Because Tule Lake, those people there from Sacramento Valley were a lot of orchard farmers. So they started planting fruit trees and they produced the fruit from the trees and not only used it for their camp, but distributed it to the other camps. So it became a very cost-cutting thing for the government and a very helpful thing for the Japanese people. Slide. Now, my uncle was 8 years old. Roger Shimomura was a lot younger than that. He's an artist in the Midwest. And so he's done a lot of drawings that depict what it was that he experienced. And so when we wonder about how early an age a child can remember, it's pretty impactful. Slide. How old was Roger Shimomura when he went into camp? 3. And he still remembers vividly to this day the blue star of an army family, the barbed wire, and the meager cake for his birthday. Slide. This picture is of the symbol for the 442nd 100th Battalion and MIS. It depicts the go for broke signal, and that was what the Japanese that volunteered for the service stood by. Now, you have to remember, when the war broke out, all of a sudden, all these people, including toddlers, were enemy aliens, or alien enemies. And so some people that were in the service already were booted. I had a friend who was in intelligence in San Francisco, Angel Island, and he got booted from the service. My mom had another friend that was in the Army in the South, and he got knocked down a rank and was sent to be in the kitchen patrol. But he always laughed, and when he told the story about when he was talking to his sergeant, it's like, what makes you think that if you can't trust me to be an officer or a non-commissioned officer, that you're safe eating my food? Always thought about that. But he became a very good cook from the Army side. So this is a letter or a statement that was posted in Hood River for those people, anybody thinking of returning to the Hood River Valley. And it's to let them know that they weren't wanted. We don't want you back. We don't care that we gave you the worst land and let you own that land because nobody else wanted it. Nobody else wanted to do the work, and you guys made it not only farmable, but profitable. We don't want you back. They took all the names off the veterans of foreign wars that were from Hood River and removed them from their roles there. And so it wasn't always fun. I know my dad had talked to us about being called names and seeing signs in windows saying that they weren't welcome. But a lot of them did return. They returned to Milwaukie, they returned to Gresham, they returned to Salem. And luckily, those people that were friends of theirs before the war were friends still. They held their belongings. Thus, I have photo albums. Thus, we have treasures, family treasures, heirlooms that were held for the families and kept in good condition. Whereas some of them that went to the temples and had things saved at the temples, those were broken into and things were destroyed or stolen. Slide. This is my family. The one on the left is my Uncle Harry. The one in the middle is my Uncle Richard. He died in October at age 96. And that was my father on the far right, my grandpa, my Uncle Henry, who was 8 at the time, and my grandma. Slide. But my grandma was sick when my dad, she was pregnant with my dad, and they were supposed to come over here before he was born so he'd be a U.S. citizen. That didn't happen. So my father had to apply for citizenship, much like all the Japanese nationals, the Issei's. And so even though he considered himself a Sansei, he was not only a Nisei, but he was also a Kibe, which means he was sent to Japan to go to school, lived with his grandma and his cousins, and then sent back to the U.S. in February of 1941. In June of 1941 was the last ship that came back from Japan. If you didn't get on that ship, one of those ships, you were stuck, as were 2 of my cousins were stuck in Japan because they went to take care of elderly relatives or went to do schooling and that sort of thing. So this is my dad's citizenship papers. So, in 1990, Ronald Reagan signed the redress and a letter of apology. My dad, when the redress process was going on, was not going to accept any money. He was infuriated by it. It was an insult. It's only for those who are still living. It doesn't apply to those people who suffered most and died before that time. But this letter of apology is what changed his mind. Recognizing that this happened to the Japanese people, what they went through, and apologized for it meant a lot to him. And so a lot of people still have that letter. He didn't spend the $20,000. He left it to us to give to our children and use it for their college fund. I want to thank you for inviting me here today. I want to thank you for this opportunity to spread the word about the Japanese experience. And slide. Again, on behalf of the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, 411 Northwest Flanders, please give them a call. Please come by and visit. Make an appointment to come by and visit, and maybe we'll run into each other. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you.
Another one of our partners is the City of Milwaukie. The City of Milwaukie invites you to contribute your ideas and ask questions about projects at times that work best for you using an online platform called Engage Milwaukie. Weigh in on improvements you would like to see in downtown and central Milwaukee. Nominate a community member for Volunteer of the Year by February 14th. And as being nominated and a 2018 Volunteer of the Year, it is really nice to do for somebody in your community. Learn more about and provide feedback about proposed code amendments related to trees, housing, and parking, and so much more. So visit engagemilwaukieoregon.gov to get started today. Slide. Jacob and I met on the Planning Commission, where we are still commissioners today. Although we may not agree on parking and transportation, we do have a fond love of history. Jacob has spent countless hours researching his house and has used the Claire Kuppenbender Library located inside Milwaukie Museum to help his project progress. This presentation tonight and everything we're trying to accomplish is because of Jacob's willingness to roll up his sleeves, do the research, and coordinate the activities. Jacob and I have spent a lot of time together over the last 3 months working on this. I am so glad. Not only is he a real well-rounded individual, but a really nice guy and now a friend. Thank you, Jacob, for everything. And ladies and gentlemen, Jacob Sherman.
Slide. Thanks, Craig. Really excited to be here this evening to talk about some of the research I've been doing about kind of our local Japanese American community. Slide. And, you know, we'll maybe start by saying I think everything Greg just said about me is very true. But part of the reason for some of this project is just maybe within my own family. I'm a fifth generation Oregonian on my mom's side. And my dad is kind of an avid genealogist. So I've kind of picked up over time a love of history. And this project started, as Greg mentioned, in researching my own house. And the image in the top of the screen is from the 1940 census, the people that lived in my home, the Jorgensens. And throughout kind of the course of this project, combing through all the 1940 census records, I started to get really curious about who the Japanese Americans were that I started seeing coming up in the census records. As you'll see kind of on the lower part of the screen, this is the Yoshitomi family with Kay, Shimo, Robert, Francis, Fran, Ed, Dorothy, and Kay. And started to kind of ask myself, okay, if this was 1940, what happened to these people when war broke out in 1942? There's been a lot of really great resources that I've been able to draw on, which I'll talk about in just a second. But I was really pleased by looking through some of the museum's records, including the yearbook collection that they have. The photo on the right, you can see Robert Yoshitomi in the middle, but the person right behind him is Jack Jorgensen, who lived in my house some 80 years ago. So this was a really cool thing that I just found a few evenings ago. Next slide. So maybe just some a quick few statements, I guess. First, I'm not an expert in Japanese American history. Certainly want to apologize for any mistakes that I might make, including butchering or mispronouncing people's names this evening. There's been a lot of research kind of sources throughout this project: archival research, deed research at the county that myself and others have done, Census Bureau, even some oral histories, some interviews that Greg and I have done. There's also been a lot of secondary research out there, pulling from websites or other publications that have already existed. Next slide. So kind of asking this question about who were the Japanese American families in Milwaukie. There's a link here that folks can look at later. We've gone through and reviewed kind of all of the census records for Milwaukie in 1940, or the Milwaukie area in 1940. There's about 6,000 people that lived in kind of the Milwaukie area. And of those 6,000, there was about 87 Japanese and Japanese American individuals living kind of within this area. It makes up about 1.5% of the population. Most of these people, for the men, were farmers or laborers. There was one individual I'm remembering who also worked in timber. Many of the women reported working at kind of market gardens or stands and being beauticians or housekeepers or students. Many Issei, people that immigrated from Japan, had gone to school in Japan through 6th or even 8th grade, and that many of the older kind of first generation children here were in high school, and several were also in college. There's a few photos here of some of the farms that were down in the Milwaukie marketplace kind of area. Next slide. So in terms of some of the families and individuals that made up the Milwaukie community, you can see kind of a list of, these are the lists of the last names of the different families. Here's a few photos from some of the yearbooks that the Milwaukie Museum has. Interestingly, with both May and Frank, I didn't find their families in the census records at all, which actually has me thinking perhaps they lived a little bit further south of Milwaukie. I never looked at the census records for Oak Grove or Jennings Lodge or Gladstone, so perhaps that might have been where they lived. I've also looked at some of the the phone book directories, and the image on the right, you can see some of the listings of the Yoshitomis and the Watanabes and where they were. Next slide. Just going to run through a few kind of quick profiles of some of the families, not all of them, before talking about where people lived. The Yoshizawa and Yamada families sold flowers that were grown in kind of a greenhouse that they owned. Some people in the 1940 census reported owning their property, others rented. The Yamadas owned and operated a truck garden, and you can see some of the members of his families, like Yoshizawa in the lower left corner of the top photo, as well as kind of a senior officer, James Yamada, kind of on the right, as well as some of the census records there. Next slide. Two kind of notable families in the area, both the Watanabes and the Yoshitomi families. This is an image of the Watanabe and Yoshitomi farm, where 15 people lived in 1940. There was the Watanabe family, and then kind of the in-laws, which was the Yoshitomis, as well as a hired hand who lived on the farm. You could see in this photo, which comes courtesy of the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, who a number of those individuals were. There's some notes on the back of the photo that Greg and myself were able to kind of look at when they so generously gave us a private tour of the museum a while ago. Next slide. The Watanabe and Yoshitomi families grew celery predominantly, but in a recent interview that Greg and I did with Ruth Watanabe, who married Dutch Watanabe. She also shared they had a small nursery. And one of the interesting things that she shared with us is that outside of the Waldorf school, there's 3 kind of large old cherry blossom trees. And those reportedly were grown from the Watanabe's farm. You could see in the image on the right some of the kind of the picking and the packing of celery at the Watanabe and Yoshitomi farm, also courtesy of the Japanese American Museum of Oregon. Next slide. The Watanabes on their property actually had a Japanese school. So there was a number of Japanese schools kind of peppered around the region. And these were really places where the community could come together and be kind of educated in both language and writing and other customs. Both these photos come from the Japanese American Museum of Oregon's archives. And the photo on the left was one I found really interesting, showing a number of the Issei ladies with their English teacher. And on the back of the real photo was all the names, and I just kind of cut and paste them on top for this image. But you can see, Miss Yoshizawa, Miss Sasaki, Shimo Yoshitomi, Chio Indo, who we'll mention in a slide or two, as well as others. And on the photo on the right, you can see kind of an image, an undated image of a bunch of children kind of in front of the museum, or in front of the school. Next slide. After the war, the school kind of reportedly became a church. So these are some images that I've found, both an image out of the University of Washington's archives on the left, as well as a photo from the Japanese American Museum on the right. From kind of what we understand, the school burned down in the early 2000s, but you can see even just from these 4 photos, kind of how it really was a source of community for many decades. Next slide. One of the other families kind of from the area that I've looked a little bit into is the Indo family. Kenichi and Chio Indo immigrated to the U.S., kind of departing out of the port of Yokohama. I have a photo maybe near the end of Kenichi's kind of travel documents leaving. They moved to Gladstone kind of originally. And one of the interesting things that Chio mentions in oral history, which people can find access to, and this really follows up on kind of what Amy was saying, for some of the people immigrating from Japan, life wasn't easy. And she talked about, coming to Gladstone in Milwaukee at the time, there was no electricity. And she makes a point of saying that she had electricity in Japan and didn't have electricity here. And actually in Japan, it sounded like she came from a fairly, successful family that was in the silk business and had a large number of employees, and she never had to work. And then all of a sudden here, toiling, physically in the fields was just a very different experience. And they grew berries and veggies to sell kind of at the public market and operated a greenhouse. They had a number of kids, the youngest of which was Kei Indo, who you could see in the lower right. He was 3 years old in 1940. There's also a really great oral histories of Kei that are also available online that I have kind of linked at the end if anyone wants to see them. And in those oral histories, Kei actually talks about the bottomlands, as he referred to them, where they farmed, being very rich. And he kind of described the soil as beaver dam brown, and really excellent and kind of nutrient rich for growing things, particularly celery. And I think, as we'll see in a few slides, we'll probably connect a few dots here in terms of what that rich beaver dam brown soil is and where it's located. Next slide. I pulled a few kind of quotes out from Chio Indo's oral history, which again is you can find online. At this time, she was over 90 years old. I think this was recorded in the early 2000s. And the interviewer is asking if she experienced any discrimination, and she shares that no, she did not, and that everyone here was really nice. She was actually asked this question in a few different ways, multiple times in her oral history, and always comes back to the people in Milwaukie being very nice. And one of the things that I think I find interesting in this is just talking the little story kind of at the end about the children not being bullied and how the teachers actually brought the kids home from school for a while because their family didn't have a car. Next slide. There was another Yoshitomi family here in Milwaukie. Keijiro and Shimo Yoshitomi, who you can see kind of in the lower left, were married in 1921 and immigrated to Milwaukie that same year. Keijiro was brothers of Sadataro, who married into the Watanabe family. So there's kind of a collection of families that are interrelated. And they operated a celery farm and had a number of children. The image in the middle is apparently kind of the first farm that Keijiro farmed. I'm unclear of the location of that, but it's just an exciting thing to kind of be able to see some of that. And one of the comments written on the back of that photo is how the horse and the cart was actually used at the time to cart in goods into the city to then sell at a public market. And again, there's a really great collection of high school yearbooks at the Milwaukie Museum. I've enjoyed looking through some of the photos, and this was one of the ones I really liked. Robert Yoshitomi is kind of center of this, and he was I get the sense from the yearbooks a very accomplished athlete and student, both serving on student government, but also playing basketball and football and a whole variety of sports. Next slide. One of the questions that I was really curious in was kind of where these families lived. There is a kind of a booklet that the Milwaukie Historical Society put together called Family Farms, 1848 to 2007. And the image in the upper left kind of lays out, a rough map of where some of the families lived. And you can see some of the different names on that map. And it's, I think, good to note that Mr. K. Indo's oral history corroborates a number of the museum records, and the 1940 census actually provides a lot of additional detail. Next slide. So kind of going back to kind of our list of families and their names, we don't necessarily always get precise addresses in the 1940 census, but you do get a street, and you can see a large collection of individuals kind of all clustered and living around Railroad Avenue, a number living on Elmer Street, which has actually since been renamed Washington Street after Highway 224 kind of came through and kind of changed traffic flows, I guess, as well as a number of families, the Yamadas living off of 82nd near Fuller Road, and the Koidas living off of Eckler Street, which is actually very close to Monroe Street, which we'll talk about in a moment. Next slide. So the Watanabes and Yoshitomis, through some of the research that Steve Bennett, involved with the Milwaukie Historical Society, has done looking at the deeds, has gone and helped kind of map and identify where these families owned property. And you could see they bought property as early as 1919 in the area kind of just south of kind of Railroad Avenue and east of 37th. Interestingly, they had that property for a period of time. There was other property transactions that happened kind of around them, where Mr. Ray Case was purchasing up other kind of land, and Mr. Case also bought property from the Meeks, and then in December of 1945, and then very interestingly, and still unclear what to make of this, sold some of that property back to the Watanabes and the Yoshitomis only 1 month later. We put together kind of a Google map, if you could pull that up, just really showing kind of the location of some of these properties kind of over present day. And so you can kind of see where the Milwaukie marketplace is, kind of on the left hand of the screen, and Railroad Avenue, 37th. And these blocks were kind of the original plats of the area. The area kind of in the orange is where the Watanabes owned land kind of by themselves, or no, the Indos, I think, owned land by themselves. And the pink is both Watanabe and Yoshitomi farms, and then the kind of bluish is just Yoshitomi farms. And going back to what Kay Endo said around kind of the beaver brown dirt, this is a very kind of wet, marshy area, and is really in many ways the source of some of kind of the groundwater streams that kind of percolate out through much of the area. So probably was a very great place to be growing celery. Next slide. One of the other places where people lived is the Coitas, living off of about 70th and Monroe, and they've been operating kind of greenhouses on what is about 10 acres for several generations, growing flowers, poinsettias, other perennials, and kind of selling those at market. And I was really interested when I found this kind of newspaper article from 1935 talking about a wedding of the Coitas to another Japanese family. Next slide. As Amy said, December 6th, 1941 really changed the experience for a number of folks. I don't know if I have much more to say other than that, but to point out, this was yet another kind of great tidbit that was sitting over at the Milwaukie Museum in some of their documents. Next slide. In her kind of oral history, Chio talks about first hearing about the war, kind of hearing about it on the radio, and that it was in English, and she didn't necessarily understand what was kind of being talked about, and that some of my slide accidentally was cut off. One of the things that was really interesting that she talks about on the bottom of the slide is there's a question about, did the FBI come over to investigate? And she talked about in her oral history that there were actually some FBI agents that came, and I believe they met with Ken Sasaki and talked with him. And she said that her brother ended up also being interviewed because he was reading a Japanese newspaper. And Greg has kind of told me a story that he's heard through the grapevine about people hearing at the time about there being maybe a spy in Milwaukie. And I would imagine that if the FBI was showing up in Milwaukie at that time, asking people, tall tales could have been spun there. One of the other interesting things about kind of hearing about the war and the war experience and talking with Ruth Watanabe, who again married Dutch Watanabe, she also told us that after the war broke out, I believe she was in high school in downtown Portland. She told Greg and I a story about how she had 3 Jewish friends at the time who, after the war broke out, they went everywhere with her, she said, to keep an eye on her and take care of her. And they even went with her to the bathroom to make sure that nothing bad would happen to her. Next slide. Amy spoke a bit about Executive Order 9066, which again kind of allowed for the forced relocation of people of Japanese heritage to internment camps. I think want to just kind of underline the vast majority of these people were U.S. citizens, which is, I think, an important thing to recognize. Next slide. In her oral interview, Chio Indo was kind of asked about needing to sell off belongings. And interestingly, she talks about actually leaving most of their things behind because of their white boss, who was kind of taking care of their belongings for them while they were gone. And that he actually helped them get to the assembly center and that she was kind of carrying kind of all that she could. Just to kind of think, I was thinking about it earlier when Amy was talking. The article here is from the Oregonian, which is Thursday, May 7th, 1942. And as you'll kind of look at, the exclusion order came out on Wednesday, and people were required to report to the assembly center on the following Tuesday. Like a week. You had a week or less to get all your stuff in order and figured out where you were going. I can only kind of imagine how hectic that must have been, especially for someone like Chio, who had 6 children. Next slide. Here's just a few other images of the internment camp at Minidoka. Amy spent a lot of time there, so we can go to the next slide. One of the interesting things that we still don't have good answers on is we've kind of heard stories, I think, including even from other Milwaukee historians like the late Enid Briggs, about how Milwaukeeans might have shown up and supported some of the Japanese Americans in the area. The second bullet point kind of talks about one of those stories where this person, Ray Case, reportedly organized a group of college boys from the Multnomah School of the Bible to help tend to the Watanabe's farm during kind of incarceration. So that story, I think, has been kind of in the community for quite a while. And in talking recently with Ruth Watanabe, she kind of confirmed that. And what's interesting is this document, which actually came out of the Japanese American Museum of Oregon's archives, actually shows that Mr. Ray Case in 1943 took a large trunk of Chio Indo's belongings to Minidoka and had it delivered there for her. So in some ways, I think there's some very interesting kind of evidence, probably more things to kind of try and uncover here about at least how one Milwaukeean was kind of showing up for the Japanese American community. Be really curious to know what other kinds of acts of support locals might have shown. Next slide. Chio was kind of asked in her oral history about experiencing harassment when she came back, and she says that she didn't, but she did find that the farm was being managed by Filipinos, and eventually it was sold, and the Watanabe or the Indos purchased it. Next slide. But not everybody, I guess, had great experiences in coming back. I found this in the Milwaukie Museum's archives. This was from a 50th reunion kind of document. So the class of 1941 got together in 1991 and reflected. And Miss Tamiyasu reports talking about, how hard it was to be in the concentration camp for 3.5 years, and that tried to put their lives back together. And they actually ended up in the Vanport flood and lost everything there. And she went on talking about other hardships. And it was just, it was challenging to kind of read and to recognize how such a kind of a destabilizing event in people's lives, could spin off in such poor and have such poor consequences. Next slide. Some of the other experiences that kind of seen is, a number of people going on to serve honorably in the service, a number of people returning to the area, and some of those people returning, building really successful businesses like the Koida florist that I mentioned earlier, or the Yoshitomis who went on to build a very successful nursery business that's still in operation today. A number of folks received honorary degrees was one thing I noticed when their college years were interrupted by the war and then went on later to get honorary degrees. And as Amy said, in 1988, the United States kind of passed the Civil Liberties Act and kind of began the process of officially apologizing for the forced incarceration of Japanese Americans. And I think with that, we can go to the next slide. And just a few things of, what's next. I am interested in looking at some of the census records kind of south of Milwaukie. Very curious to look at more property sales information and try and uncover more about who Mr. Ray Case and other potential friends of Japanese Americans were. And I'm excited for, as Councilor Nicodemus said, this proclamation that's happening, in 2 weeks or so, helping recognize the 80th anniversary of the forced internment of Japanese Americans. So I think with that, I'll go to my last slide and not spend a lot of time here. I think there's a lot of folks to thank, but really want to thank the Japanese American Museum of Oregon for being such great partners in this, as well as the Milwaukie Museum for kind of opening up the archives. Would really encourage folks who have other kind of curious questions to kind of, as Greg said, you dig in and roll up your sleeves and help unearth other history. And would be remiss to also not forget to thank the Clackamas County Arts Alliance for their support for some of this event. So thank you very much.
Just so everybody knows, at that council meeting, February 15th, the special guest will be Kay Endo. So you can kind of hear from his own words about his experiences. So tonight you are seeing this program because of our great partner, Willamette Falls Studio. Willamette Falls Studio's mission is to inspire lifelong learning, advance knowledge, and define communications through digital media technology to educate and strengthen communities. Their professional staff work daily to create media content for local organizations, capture city projects, consults on productions, customize broadcast systems, and provides technical support. The staff at Willamette Falls Studio work with all levels of experience in media production. Any resident of the 5 service areas can learn how to be a WFS producer at little to no out-of-pocket cost. All they require is playback of your final project on the public channel. The Barlow Trail experience is on the loop on Comcast Channel 30 about every 4 hours if you have not cut that program yet. Come in and talk to their staff about how they can help you with your communications needs. Essentially, WFS provides residents with a porthole into their community through televised local government meetings and community-produced programming, coupled with the training to create and share their views. Residents have a unique opportunity not only to access the community's global perspective, but to help also shape it. Slide. I want to thank our guest speakers tonight, Councilor Desi Nicodemus, Amy Mishima Peterson, and Jacob Sherman. A really heartfelt thanks to Scott Stauffer with the City of Milwaukie, Katie Newell with the Letting Library, and Melody Ashford of the Willamette Falls Studios. All of your hard work and willingness to spend the hours putting these programs together are much appreciated. Once again, to learn more about our great Japanese American heritage, visit Japanese American Museum of Oregon and Milwaukie Museum. If you want to watch this program again, it will be available on City of Milwaukie and Milwaukie Heritage YouTube pages. Remember to tune in March 2nd for our next Letting Library lecture series entitled Women's History Project, A Personal Perspective. And once again, my name is Greg Hemer, the Communications Director for Milwaukie Historical Society, saying arigato gozaimasu for watching. Thank you.